And lastly, and I leave it lastly to Cuba because it's one that's been more enduring, the problem in Cuba basically is that despite being a communist regime and Marxism not working, is that they've decided, and they thought what they would do is that they would create this holding company. It's called GAESA. It is a company that they own by the Cuban military, and that holding company owns everything that makes money in Cuba. If it makes money in Cuba, they own it, and it generates revenue for them. The Miami Herald just did an expose on GAESA. And while you have electrical blackouts and you have all these other problems economically in Cuba, GAESA is sitting on billions of dollars that they've generated for their permanency. In 2017, the Trump administration sanctioned GAESA.
Imagine waking up to the news that your country's top officials are suddenly banned from entering the United States. No explanation, no warning, just revoked visas. Now imagine that this is happening because of a single decision, working with Cuban doctors.
They're known as the Army of White Coats, and their medical teams have been dispatched from Havana to help at least 16 countries, including South Africa, Qatar, and Italy.
This is exactly the reality facing CARICOM nations like Jamaica, Trinidad, and others right now. Trump's administration, through Marco Rubio, has issued a chilling threat. Either CARICOM nations cut ties with Cuba's medical program or risk losing visas for their government officials and their families. But what does this mean for Jamaica? Should Jamaica comply? Or is this just another strong-arm tactic by the U.S. to control the Caribbean? And most importantly, what happens next? Stay locked in as we dive deep into the biggest diplomatic war Jamaica has faced in years. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button because we're bringing you unfiltered facts on the biggest geopolitical moves affecting the Caribbean. The U.S. warning. What was said? On February 25, 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made an explosive announcement. The United States is expanding its visa restriction policy against anyone involved in Cuba's medical export program. This means government officials, even in Jamaica, who continue to employ Cuban doctors could lose their U.S. visas. And it doesn't stop there. The families of these officials are also being targeted. Rubio claims that Cuba's medical program is a form of forced labor, alleging that the Cuban government is profiting off its own doctors while depriving Cuba itself of medical professionals. The policy also already targeted Venezuelan officials under the same logic, and now the Caribbean is next in line. But here's the real question. If Jamaica continues working with Cuban doctors, could this mean that top government officials, including Prime Minister Andrew Holness, could be blocked from traveling to the U.S.? And even worse, is this just the beginning of America's crackdown on Caribbean nations working with Cuba? Family, over 60% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you've made it this far, that means you value these deep dives into Caribbean geopolitics. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The more we grow, the louder our voices get on issues that truly matter to Jamaica and the Caribbean. Section 2. Why Jamaica needs Cuban doctors. Jamaica heavily relies on Cuban doctors. For decades, Cuba has sent its best medical professionals to help fill gaps in Jamaica's healthcare system. Hundreds of Cuban doctors and nurses work in Jamaican hospitals. They've been critical in handling outbreaks, disasters, and medical crises. During COVID-19, Cuba sent over 400 doctors and nurses to assist Jamaica and other Caribbean nations. Jamaica's healthcare system already struggles with doctor shortages and long wait times, so cutting ties with Cuba would be devastating. But now, with Trump pressuring CARICOM, will Jamaica be forced to abandon Cuban medical aid?
As you know, we have a long-standing relationship with Cuba and the Cuban government, and in the area of medical care. We have the Cuban Eye Care Program. We have over 300 Cuban healthcare professionals who are here already, and they provide significant value to our public health system. And that has been a long-standing tradition. So today, what we are witnessing is a continuation of that friendship and relationship.
Why Trump is targeting Cuba and CARICOM. The real reason behind this U.S. crackdown isn't about protecting Cuban doctors. It's about U.S. influence in the Caribbean. It's about controlling Jamaica's foreign policy. And it's about stopping Cuba from gaining power in the region. For decades, the U.S. has tried to cripple Cuba economically, using embargoes and sanctions. But Cuba's medical program has been a key way for Havana to stay afloat. Trump and Rubio want to cut off this revenue stream by forcing CARICOM nations to abandon Cuba. And here's where it gets even deeper. This isn't just about Cuba. This is about Jamaica's growing relationship with BRICS. Jamaica has been warming up to BRICS nations like China, Brazil, and Russia, and Washington is not happy about it. Could this visa threat be a warning for Jamaica to stay loyal to the U.S.? How CARICOM is responding. CARICOM's Council for Foreign and Community Relations, COFCR, met on February 28 to discuss the situation. They are now seeking urgent clarification from the U.S. on what this visa policy really means for Caribbean officials. Will all government officials be affected? Are health ministers specifically being targeted? Will Jamaica be forced to phase out Cuban doctors? And most importantly, will CARICOM stand united, or will some nations bow to U.S. pressure? The stakes are high, and the region is at a crossroads. What happens next? If Jamaica refuses to comply, will Trump take further action? Could the U.S. cut foreign aid, restrict trade, or even increase visa restrictions for regular Jamaican citizens? And what about China? If Jamaica turns away from the U.S., could China step in to support Cuba and Caribbean nations? This is a geopolitical battle bigger than just visas. It's about who really controls the Caribbean's future, Washington or a rising BRICS alliance. This issue is far from over, and it directly affects you as a Jamaican or Caribbean citizen. Do you think Jamaica should stand firm with Cuba, or should the government reconsider its relationship to avoid U.S. backlash? Comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you want to stay informed on how global politics is shaping the Caribbean, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Next up, we'll be covering how Trump's policies could affect Caribbean trade with China. Stay tuned.
And that's a dynamic that they're facing right now. I hope that they will choose the path of empowering the individual Cuban so that the individual Cuban has the ability to do what the peoples of virtually every other country in the hemisphere have been able to do at least once in the last 60 years, and some more than once, and that is elect their leaders, vote for their leaders. You think about what happened here today. The Cuban people have no idea what it's like to have an authority figure or someone in charge and power, like I am as a U.S. Senator, sitting here having to answer questions from his colleagues, and also having to have people in the back screaming and protesting against you. You can't do that to a Cuban official. You can't question their decisions. The Cuban people have never been able to participate in a political process. In 2017, the Trump administration sanctioned Gaesa. Unfortunately, the Biden administration lifted some of those sanctions and restrictions a couple of years ago, which increased the amount of money they're able to generate through things like manipulating remittances and the like. And then yesterday, the Biden administration announced they were rescinding all of the sanctions on Gaesa, which basically the sanctions were this. You can do business with an independent individual Cuban, but you cannot, it's the regime that doesn't allow it. You cannot do business with anything owned by that government-run entity. And yesterday they lifted the sanctions on them. Now, the new administration is not bound by that decision, but nonetheless, that's what's in place. Ultimately, the moment of truth is arriving. Cuba is literally collapsing, both generationally in terms of all the young people leaving, but it's also collapsing economically. They are now living on 20 and 21-hour rolling blackouts and some days longer because Marxism doesn't work, because they're corrupt, and because they're inept. And they're going to have a choice to make, those that are in charge there. Do they open up to the world? Do they allow the individual Cuban to have control over their economic and political destiny, even though it threatens the security and stability of the regime? Or do they triple down and just say, we'd rather be the owners and controllers of a fourth world country that's falling apart and has lost 10% of its population in the last 2 years?